Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome. Today I am making a card for the Daily Markers 30-Day Coloring Challenge. I am using a stamp set by Waffle called Stay Cool. I'm creating a one-layer card here, so I'm going to be creating a scene. I'm stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink because I'll be doing some Copic coloring. And I have a piece of Nina Solar White cardstock, 80 pound, cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Any image that is going to be in front of another, I'll be stamping first, masking that out with Simon Says Stamp masking paper, and then stamping whatever image will be behind it. So I stamp that little drink, then that bear, and then the blanket that he'll be laying on. Over to the right, I stamped this little duck that's in this little tube here, as well as there's an image of another bear that's appears to be somewhat underwater. And I stamped him over on the right side as well. That'll be where my water is, and my sand will be over to the left. Once I had all of my images stamped and masked out, I just took a pencil and kind of gave myself a rough idea of how I was going to do my ink blending and where I wanted my certain areas to be as far as the sand, the water, and the sky. I took a piece of Post-it note tape and masked out the bottom. I'll be using Distress Oxide inks for the sky. I used Squeeze Lemonade in the center and blended that out with Carved Pumpkin, and then I'll be using Abandoned Coral on both of the edges. This will be creating my light source right in the center of the card where that sun actually is. It'll give the illusion that the sun is in the center. Once that was blended out, I went ahead and carefully removed my Post-it note tape there, just trying to be careful that I don't remove my other masks with it. I took a larger piece of that same Simon Says Stamp masking paper and just cut out that little curve there. I didn't do a great job because it didn't match up with my pencil lines at all, but I made do. So I masked out where the water is so that I can use regular Distress inks in the color Antique Linen for where that sand will be. And I just kept this one color. Now for that water, I was going to use that negative piece of that same piece of masking paper, but I ended up trimming it down so it didn't match up with that line. So I matched it up the best I could, and that other little area, I just used another piece of Post-it note tape. And I know it's not perfect, but I can clean up any rough edges with a Copic marker later. I'm using Distress inks in the color Salty Ocean and Mermaid Lagoon, concentrating on the back of the panel being a little bit darker than the front. Once all my ink blending was done, I went ahead and removed all my masks. I realized that that little bear that was underneath the water, the mask had come up with one of the other masks at some point, but that's okay because it's going to look like he's going to be underwater. I'm just going to color right over that Distress ink. Before I started my actual coloring, I used my B02 marker just to clean up some of those areas where my mask didn't really line up that well. And then I'll move on to coloring my images. For my bears, I am using my E50 markers. And I'll start by coloring this little one that is underneath the water. I'm just going to go right over that blue. It'll be a little bit different of a shade than it is where there is no Distress ink, but it'll just give the illusion that he is somewhat underneath that water. I start by laying out my lightest color, which for this one is a E55. And then I go in with my E59 and just lay out where my shadows will be, which will be underneath those little goggles and on either side of him, being the light source is right in the center, and he's towards the center of the panel. Once that's blended out, I will go back in with my E55 and just blend the rest of those out. For this larger bear, the darkest areas will be on the bottom of him towards his back, and he's got a pretty big belly, so that'll be the lightest area because that'll be closest to that sun or to that light source. I started off with my E55 again, then went in with my E59, then E57, and then back with my E55. I wasn't getting enough contrast because he's a lot larger than that other bear that is inside the water. So once I had my E55 blended out, I did end up going back in with my E50 and just added that highlight right to the top of his belly. For his little drink that is sitting in front of him, it looks like a little coconut, but I didn't want to use my E50 markers or even my E30 markers just because that would blend in too much with the sand. So I'm going in with my E70 markers. And again, I just do the same thing by starting off with my lightest color and mapping out my shadows. For this particular image, my darkest area will be off to the left. And of course, those little lines that are coming down to give that little coconut some dimension. I go back in with my E74 and blend that out, and then back to my lightest color. There's little leaves that are underneath that little coconut, and these are really, really tiny areas. So I just used a 2 marker blend on this. I'm using my G03 and my G07. Not really concentrating on a light source for these just because they are so tiny. I'll just keep the darkest area right in the center of those leaves. For the umbrella, I left my darkest area within those lines there where the umbrella would be bowed out a little bit. For my little duck, I am starting off with my Y02, mapping out my darkest areas, which will in this case be off to the right and underneath his little wing. And then going back in with my 08 and blending that out with my 02. It looks like his eye is closed, so I just colored right over that. I didn't add anything additional. For this larger bear's swimming trunks, as well as the little tube that this duck is in, I'm going to be coloring these red. I started off with my R22 and laid out my darkest areas. For the swimming trunks, it will be to the bottom, same as the rest of the bear. For the tube, I created a couple of different highlights just to give the illusion that it is a round object. I go in with my darkest color, which is an R59, which is a pretty dark red, but that'll just help give it dimension and make this look round in the end. I am using really light flicking motions and extending my flicks to different lengths to make it look not only round, but it would be a shiny object. So this helps give that effect as well. You can leave some white highlights in that tube and it will help give it even more dimension, but I did end up blending it all out with my R22 once I was done. For the larger leaves that are on top of this little duck. I'm using my YG markers and 1G marker. For this larger leaf, the darkest area would be on the bottom towards the duck. And for the other little leaf, that would be darker than the larger leaf anyway because it is further away from the light source. So I added my shading to the bottom as well as these little kind of like notches in the top of the leaf where it's indented in. I just created very small triangles, and then with each color that I bring in, I'll blend those out a little bit more. I did not use my lightest color on that smaller leaf because, like I said, it would be a little bit darker. So my lightest color for that one is actually the mid-tone for the larger leaf. Next, for this little blanket that the larger bear is laying on top of, I'll be using my RV markers for this, and I'll also be using my RV markers for what's inside of that little coconut there. For my darkest areas on the blanket, it would actually be underneath the bear, kind of like where he would be casting a shadow, and the outer parts of the blanket will actually be the lightest. You have to be careful with the RV markers, especially with your lightest color. When you go back in with your lightest color at the end, you'll have to make sure that you don't go over the entire thing. They tend to pick up a lot of color the lighter it is, kind of like the colorless blender would. So you just want to make sure that you concentrate just on the outside with your lightest color. For the little straw that's hanging out of his drink, as well as this little scuba gear that this other bear has, I wanted these to look white, so I'm going in with my C markers. I was originally going to use 3, but I ended up only using 2. These are really, really tiny areas, so I just used my C1 and my C3 marker. I ended up coloring over this entire tube, including these little polka dots that are within the image. So once my coloring was done, I went ahead and took my white gel pen and just added those back in. And I added a couple of lines on top of these little goggles to make it look like there is a reflection. Next, I took some inexpensive white acrylic paint that you can get at any craft store. I squeezed that onto an acrylic block and just added a little bit of water to dilute that down. I'm using a small flat brush here just to mix that in and just plop that on underneath the little duck as well as underneath the little bear that is in the water, just to kind of show that there is a reflection in that water. Next, I used a VersaFine ink to go ahead and stamp my sentiment in the top left-hand corner. And I took a wink of Stella just to add a little bit of shimmer to that larger bear's swimming trunks as well as the face of those goggles. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a great day.